The sun was setting over Arlington, Virginia, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Lieutenant General James Williams had just finished another productive community meeting where he discussed ways to improve local education programs. After 3 decades of serving his country, he still believed in making a difference, one neighborhood at a time. Sliding into his dark blue sedan, he loosened his tie slightly, the only sign that he was finally letting his guard down after a long day. His car was nothing flashy, just a reliable 4-door that blended in with others on the road. The leather seats still had that faint new car smell, mixed with the coffee he'd spilled last week rushing to a morning briefing. As he drove through the familiar streets of his community, his mind wandered to the meeting's highlights. The local high school needed mentors for their STEM program, and he had some contacts at the Pentagon who might be interested. The general had always believed that every child deserved a chance to reach for the stars, just like he had. The evening traffic was light, with streetlights starting to flicker on one by one. He drove past the local diner, where he often grabbed breakfast, the park where he took his morning jogs, and the library where his grandkids loved to spend their weekends. These streets were more than just roads to him. They were home. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, asking if he'd pick up some milk on the way home. He smiled, thinking about how even a high-ranking military officer couldn't escape everyday errands. The neighborhood grocery store was just a few blocks ahead, and he planned to make a quick stop. The radio played softly in the background, some classic soul music that reminded him of Sunday afternoons at his parents' house when he was young. He hummed along, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, completely unaware that his ordinary evening was about to take an extraordinary turn. His rearview mirror suddenly lit up with flashing blue lights. Williams checked his speed. He was going exactly the limit. He glanced at his signals, his seatbelt, everything was in order as always. Years of military discipline had made following rules second nature to him. Still, he could see a police cruiser pulling up behind him, its lights demanding attention. As he carefully signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, Williams took a deep breath. Despite his rank, despite his achievements, despite everything he'd done for his country, he knew that sometimes none of that mattered when you were a black man being pulled over at dusk. He reached for his registration and insurance papers, movements deliberate and calm, just as he taught his son and grandson to do. The sun had almost disappeared now, leaving the street in that strange twilight where shadows played tricks on the eyes. As he waited for the officer to approach, Williams thought about all the young soldiers he'd mentored over the years, about the changes he'd seen, and the changes still needed. He didn't know it yet, but this routine traffic stop was about to become much more than just another story to tell. In his side mirror, he could see the officer walking up, hand already resting on his weapon. The general's heart rate stayed steady. He'd faced much worse in his career, but there was something in the officer's walk, something in his approach, that told Williams this evening was about to become very interesting indeed. Officer Bennett wasn't having a good day. 3 traffic violations had slipped through his fingers, his coffee had gone cold, and his supervisor had been on his case about paperwork. Now, as the evening settled in, he spotted the dark blue sedan making what he decided was a suspicious turn, though any other observer would have called it perfectly normal. The truth was, Bennett had been on edge lately. His recent performance reviews hadn't been great, and he felt he had something to prove. Fresh out of the academy 3 years ago, he pictured himself making big arrests, not handling routine traffic stops in quiet neighborhoods. That frustration had been building, making him see threats where there weren't any. As he flipped on his cruiser's lights, Bennett noticed how smoothly the sit-in pulled over. No hesitation, no sudden movements. The driver clearly knew the drill. But instead of recognizing this as a sign of cooperation, Bennett's mind twisted it into something else. In his head, he'd already written a story about this stop, and it wasn't a friendly one. Stepping out of his patrol car, Bennett's boots crunched on loose gravel. His hand rested on his weapon, a habit he developed that was more intimidation than actual safety in this peaceful suburb. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of kids playing basketball somewhere down the block. Through the rear window, Bennett could see the driver sitting perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly where they should be. This, too, somehow made Bennett more suspicious rather than less. His training should have told him this was model behavior, but tonight his judgment was clouded by something darker. As he approached the driver's side window, Bennett puffed up his chest, trying to make his frame more imposing. His flashlight beam swept across the car's interior, far brighter than necessary for the early evening hour. The beam revealed an immaculate interior, a dry-cleaned jacket hanging in the back, and a man whose posture spoke of authority even while seated. "License and registration," Bennett barked, skipping the customary greeting. His voice came out harder than department policy recommended, and he knew it. The driver's calm, "Yes, sir," in response only seemed to irritate him more. There was something about the man's dignity that Bennett found challenging, though he couldn't, or wouldn't, admit why. The driver's movements were slow and deliberate as he reached for his documents. Bennett watched, his flashlight beam never wavering, as perfectly manicured hands produced a leather wallet. In any other situation, everything about this stop would have screamed upstanding citizen. But Bennett had already decided this was going to be something else. "Step out of the vehicle," Bennett ordered, even though there was absolutely no reason for this command. The driver paused for just a moment, not in defiance, but in careful consideration. That pause was all Bennett needed to justify, in his mind, escalating the situation. What Officer Bennett didn't realize was that his next actions would not only change the course of his evening, but would spark a conversation that would echo through his department and beyond. As the driver carefully opened his door, neither man knew that this moment would soon become a turning point in both their lives, though for very different reasons. The street had grown quieter now, with only the soft hum of crickets and distant traffic breaking the evening silence. Lieutenant General Williams stepped out of his car with the same calm dignity he'd shown throughout his 30 years of military service. Each movement was purposeful, his hands always visible, a routine he wished he didn't have to know so well. "Stand over here," Officer Bennett demanded, pointing to the space between their vehicles. The general complied, his shoes crunching softly on the asphalt. The police cruiser's flashing lights painted everything in alternating waves of blue and red, creating strange shadows that danced across both men's faces. Years of commanding troops had taught Williams how to read people, and everything about this young officer's body language screamed insecurity masked as aggression. The general could see the slight tremor in Bennett's hands, the way he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, the exaggerated authority in his voice. All signs of someone trying too hard to prove something. "Sir," Williams spoke clearly and calmly, "may I ask why I was stopped?" His voice carried the natural authority of someone used to addressing rooms full of high-ranking officials. This seemed to throw Officer Bennett off balance for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his face hardening. "I'll ask the questions here," Bennett snapped, circling around Williams like a boxer sizing up an opponent. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The question hung in the air, its implications clear and uncomfortable. Williams had heard this question too many times before, in too many places where he supposedly didn't belong. "I live 3 blocks from here," Williams replied evenly. "I'm returning home from a community meeting." He kept his tone respectful but firm, decades of experience helping him maintain his composure. In his mind, he was already thinking about how this interaction could be used to improve police training. Bennett's flashlight beam swept over Williams's civilian clothes, his well-tailored suit, his polished shoes, his tie that cost more than Bennett's entire uniform. Instead of recognizing these as signs of a successful professional, Bennett's prejudices twisted them into more reasons for suspicion. "Let me see some ID," Bennett demanded, though Williams had already provided his license earlier. The general reached slowly for his wallet again, but this time he pulled out a different ID, his military credentials. Bennett's reaction came too quickly, too aggressively. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Bennett shouted, his hand moving to his weapon. The sudden escalation drew the attention of a couple walking their dog across the street. They slowed down, phones appearing in their hands, ready to record. Williams didn't move a muscle, his hands frozen in midair, his military ID catching the gleam of the streetlights. He'd faced down threats in war zones with less tension than this moment on a peaceful suburban street. The irony wasn't lost on him, that he could command thousands of troops, but was now at the mercy of one nervous officer's prejudices. "Officer," Williams spoke with measured calm, "I'm following your instructions. I'm simply showing you my identification as requested." His voice carried the weight of authority without aggression, the skill of a man who had spent his life leading others through crisis situations. Just then, another set of headlights swept across the scene as a second police car pulled up. The cavalry was arriving, but not the kind Officer Bennett had been hoping for. The next few moments would change everything, though neither man knew it yet. As the supervisor's car door opened, the evening air felt charged with possibility, the kind that could either spark disaster or light the way to something better. The police supervisor's arrival changed the energy of the scene instantly. Sergeant Thompson stepped out of his car, immediately taking in the tableau before him. The well-dressed man, standing calmly with his hands raised, Officer Bennett's aggressive stance, and the military ID glinting under the streetlights. Something wasn't adding up. The evening air felt thick with tension as Sergeant Thompson approached. He'd spent 20 years on the force and knew when something was off. As he got closer, his eyes widened with recognition. He'd seen this man before, not just seen him, but heard him speak at last month's Community Leadership Conference. Lieutenant General Williams. Thompson's voice carried a mix of surprise and dismay. The name hung in the air like a thundercloud. Officer Bennett's face went from aggressive to confused, then to a sickly pale as realization began to dawn. His hand, which had been hovering near his weapon, dropped limply to his side. "Good evening, Sergeant Thompson," Williams replied with the same calm dignity he maintained throughout the entire encounter. "I believe there's been some misunderstanding about my presence in my own neighborhood." The words were delivered without anger, but their impact was undeniable. Sergeant Thompson turned to Officer Bennett, whose tough demeanor had completely crumbled. "Stand down, officer," Thompson ordered, his voice carrying years of authority. Bennett took a step back, looking like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly, casting nervous shadows. "Sir," Thompson addressed Williams, his tone respectful and professional, "I sincerely apologize for this incident." He walked closer, positioning himself between Bennett and the general. The blue and red lights still pulsed rhythmically, now highlighting the stark contrast between Williams's composed presence and Bennett's deflated posture. The small audience that had gathered, the couple with their dog, a few neighbors who had stepped onto their porches, watched in silent witness. Their phones captured everything, though no one spoke. The only sound was the soft whir of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. "Your reputation for community service precedes you, General," Thompson continued, genuine respect in his voice. "Your work with the youth mentorship program has been invaluable." Williams nodded acknowledgement, finally lowering his hands. The movement seemed to snap Officer Bennett out of his shocked stupor. I didn't know," Bennett stammered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. His words hung awkwardly in the air, unintentionally highlighting the very problem at the heart of the situation. Williams turned to face him, and for the first time that evening, spoke with the full weight of his authority. "That's precisely the point, Officer Bennett," he said, his voice level but powerful. "You didn't know who I was when you stopped me. You didn't know about my service record, my community work, or my rank. You made assumptions, and those assumptions could have led to serious consequences. The truth of these words seemed to physically impact Bennett, who took another step back. Sergeant Thompson watched the interaction carefully, his mind already racing with the implications of this incident. He knew this moment would have repercussions far beyond this evening. The streetlights seemed to grow brighter as clouds moved away from the moon, illuminating the scene like a stage. Here stood three men, one who'd faced war zones with courage, one who'd served his community for decades, and one young officer whose worldview was being shattered in real time. The next few moments would determine not just the outcome of this incident, but potentially the future of police-community relations in their town. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Sergeant Thompson took charge of the situation, his movements quick and professional. The flashing lights from the police cruiser were finally switched off, returning the street to its normal evening calm. The sudden absence of the blue and red pulses made everything feel more real, more serious. "Officer Bennett, return to your vehicle and wait for me there," Thompson ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Bennett walked back to his cruiser, his shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the aggressive officer from just minutes before. His footsteps seemed to echo in the quiet street, each one heavy with the weight of his actions. The neighbors who had gathered started to drift away, though their phones had captured everything. An older lady across the street lingered on her porch, shaking her head sadly. She'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and had seen too many scenes like this, though perhaps none with such a dramatic turn. "General Williams," Thompson began, pulling out his notepad, "I'd like to get your full statement about what happened here." His pen hovered over the paper, ready to document every detail. Williams stood straight, his military bearing natural and unstudied, as he began recounting the events of the evening. "I was returning from a community meeting of the new youth mentorship program," Williams explained, his voice steady. "Officer Bennett pulled me over without explaining why. From there, things escalated quickly." He described each step of the interaction with precise detail, the kind of thorough reporting that came from years of military service. As Williams spoke, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the street. The smell of someone's dinner, pot roast, maybe, wafted through the air, a mundane reminder that ordinary life was continuing just yards away from this extraordinary moment. A cat wandered past, completely uninterested in the human drama unfolding around it. Thompson wrote everything down, his pen scratching against the paper. His face grew more concerned with each detail. "Sir, I want you to know that this will be thoroughly investigated," he said, looking up from his notepad. "This isn't how we train our officers to behave." Williams glanced over at Bennett's cruiser, where the young officer sat staring straight ahead. "You know, Sergeant," he said thoughtfully, "in the military, we learn that mistakes can be our best teachers, if we're willing to learn from them." The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of experience and wisdom. A few streetlights flickered on as the evening grew darker. The temperature had dropped slightly, and Thompson noticed Williams was still standing there in his suit jacket. "Sir, you're free to go home now," he said apologetically. "We'll need to follow up with you tomorrow, but we have everything we need for tonight." But Williams wasn't quite ready to leave. He turned to look at Bennett's car again, then back at Thompson. "Before I go," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to making important decisions, "I'd like to make a suggestion. This incident shouldn't just disappear into a filing cabinet somewhere." Thompson's eyebrows raised slightly, curious. The general continued, "Maybe we can turn this into something positive. Something that helps prevent similar situations in the future." As he spoke, a thought began forming in Thompson's mind, one that would soon lead to significant changes in the department. The crickets had started their evening chorus in earnest now, providing a gentle backdrop to this important conversation. In the distance, a dog barked, and someone called their child in for dinner. Life was going on around them, but here, on this quiet suburban street, something significant was taking shape. A moment that would ripple out far beyond this evening and this neighborhood. By the next morning, the police station was buzzing with activity. The chief of police sat at his desk, watching the dashcam footage for the third time. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten as he focused on the scene unfolding on his computer screen. 30 years on the force hadn't prepared him for the mix of emotions he felt watching this incident. Outside his office, phones were ringing nonstop. News of the incident had spread quickly through social media, and local reporters were already asking for comments. The chief could see his secretary fielding calls through the glass partition, her expression growing more worried with each ring. "Get me Sergeant Thompson," he called through the intercom. Within minutes, Thompson appeared in his office, looking like he hadn't slept much. The events of the previous evening had kept him up most of the night, reviewing procedures and thinking about what needed to change. "The dashcam footage confirms everything in General Williams' statement," the chief said, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. This is about systemic issues we can't ignore anymore." Thompson nodded, pulling out a notebook filled with ideas he jotted down during his sleepless night. Down the hall, Officer Bennett sat in the Internal Affairs office, his uniform feeling uncomfortably tight around his neck. The investigator across the desk asked questions in a neutral tone, but Bennett could feel the weight of disappointment in every pause. His answers sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Walk me through your thought process," the investigator prompted, pen poised over her notepad. Bennett opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he explain decisions that made no sense in the light of day? The silence stretched out, broken only by the soft ticking of the wall clock. Meanwhile, in the conference room, a hastily assembled group of senior officers reviewed department policies. Papers were spread across the table, coffee cups stationed like soldiers between documents. They'd been at it for hours, highlighting problems, suggesting changes, debating solutions. "Look at this," one captain said, holding up a training manual. "Our section on community engagement is barely 3 pages long. How can we expect officers to build trust when we barely teach them how?" Heads nodded around the table as notes were made and pages were flagged for revision. The chief's phone buzzed. A message from General Williams. Instead of filing a formal complaint, the general had sent a proposal. He offered to help develop new training programs, to share his experiences and perspective. The chief read the message twice, hope mixing with professional admiration. In the break room, officers on their lunch break discussed the incident in hushed tones. Young officers who had graduated with Bennett tried to reconcile the friend they knew with the man in the dashcam footage. Veteran officers shared similar stories from their early days, acknowledging how much they'd learned since then. By late afternoon, the chief called a department-wide meeting. The station's largest room was packed, with officers standing along the walls. The air conditioning hummed overhead as he stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of his department. "Today we stand at a crossroads," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "What happened last night was unacceptable, but it's also an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to better serve our community." The room was silent, every eye focused on him. On the streets outside, life went on as usual. Citizens walked past the station, some glancing in with newfound curiosity. Inside, though, something was shifting. Change was coming, not with the dramatic flare of sirens and flashing lights, but with the steady determination of people who knew they could do better. 2 weeks after the incident, the community center's main hall was packed to capacity. People from all walks of life sat side by side: police officers, teachers, business owners, and residents. The air buzzed with conversation, a mix of hope and skepticism floating through the room. At the front, Lieutenant General Williams stood with the police chief, reviewing their presentation notes one last time. "Are you sure about this?" the chief asked quietly, watching as more people squeezed into the already crowded room. Williams nodded, his expression determined. He'd spent countless hours preparing for this moment, turning a negative experience into something that could bring real change to his community. The meeting began with the police chief addressing the crowd. Behind him, a screen showed statistics and data, but it was the personal stories that held everyone's attention. Officers shared their experiences, both good and bad. Community members spoke about their fears and hopes. The usual barrier between uniform and civilian seemed to soften as people really listened to each other. In the middle of the room sat Officer Bennett. He'd asked to be there, though it wasn't easy facing the community. When it was his turn to speak, his voice shook slightly, but he pushed through. "I made assumptions that night," he admitted, looking around the room. "Assumptions that could have had terrible consequences. I'm here to learn, to do better." An elderly woman stood up next, her voice carrying years of wisdom. She'd lived in the neighborhood for decades and had seen both progress and setbacks. "What matters now," she said, "is what we do with this moment. Are we going to just talk, or are we going to make real changes?" Williams stepped forward then, explaining his vision for a new training program. It wasn't just about policies and procedures, it was about understanding each other. He described workshops where officers would spend time in the community not as law enforcement, but as neighbors and learners. Change doesn't happen overnight, he explained, his military experience lending weight to his words. But it does happen through small actions, through daily choices, through each of us deciding to see each other as human beings first. The energy in the room shifted as people broke into small discussion groups. Officers sat with community members, sharing coffee and cookies while talking about real issues. In one corner, a rookie cop and a high school teacher discovered they had similar ideas about youth mentorship. Near the windows, a grandmother taught a veteran officer the secret to her famous cookies while they discussed community patrol strategies. Children played at the back of the room, too young to understand the significance of what was happening, but somehow sensing the importance. Their laughter provided a perfect backdrop to the serious discussions taking place, a reminder of who would benefit from the changes being planned. As the evening progressed, people began exchanging phone numbers and making plans. A local business owner offered to host monthly community police breakfasts. A retired teacher volunteered to help with cultural sensitivity training. Even the usually quiet library assistant stood up to suggest a reading program that could bring officers and young people together. The meeting ran over its scheduled time, but nobody seemed to mind. People lingered afterward, continuing conversations in small groups. Officer Bennett found himself in a long discussion with a youth group leader about starting a basketball program. His face showed genuine interest, not the forced politeness of someone just doing their job. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the community center windows, Williams watched the scene with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Real change would take time, patience, and commitment from everyone involved. But looking around the room at all these people talking, listening, and working together, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope.